we could probably get started. We've got a core group here. So welcome everybody to today's Cecil Gibb Seminar Series. First of all, I'll hand off to Michaela to give us a bit of the housekeeping rules, and then I'll introduce our speaker for today.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining the Psychology Seminar Series. Just a few housekeeping rules. Just a reminder that this seminar is being recorded and will be available on the Psychology YouTube playlist. Questions are welcomed and can be asked by the Q&A function or by raising your hand. If raising your hand, you will be invited to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you for your attention, and I will now hand off to our theme convener, Kate Reynolds.
And I'm just
great. So I've handed my convening role on to Erin. So over to you, Erin. Yeah.
On the mic. So hello everybody. Today I want to welcome Colin Klein, who is a professor in the School of Philosophy at ANU. His research focuses on philosophy of psychology with a special interest in methodological challenges to understanding complex phenomena. He received his PhD from Princeton University in 2007, and before ANU, he taught at Macquarie University and the University of Illinois at Chicago. Now, you might also be familiar with Professor Colin Klein's work on Reddit and conspiracy theories, which went sort of viral itself last year. Colin, you're probably still getting questions. We're really delighted to have you here today and have this, I think, a really well-matched exchange of ideas across our two different fields of research. So very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Erin. Thanks, Kate. Let me get this shared here and we'll get started. Great. So, everyone see that all right? That looks good. All right, great, thanks. All right, thanks. Well, thank you guys for having me over. This may be a bit odd in terms of a psychology talk, so I should say this is ongoing work right now. It's actually a very nice time to present some of this because we're starting to write up some of these things and still trying to figure out how to contextualize stuff. As some background, as Erin mentioned, so I am a philosopher by training, but I've gotten interested in a lot of things, particularly on conspiracy theories. So I sometimes feel like the cop who ends up like chewing on his donut while everyone else keeps looking at the corpse in the trunk. So looking at a lot of like kind of problematic communities online. Now, some of this is, and I think it's been interesting, I got interested in this originally when I was at Macquarie. I was working with people in the belief formation lab there, Max Coulthard and Robin Langdon, working on delusions. And there's a lot of talk about conspiracy theories in the delusions literature as a possible like kind of preclinical or non-clinical analog of certain kinds of delusions. But you get communities of people who are very hard to study in a lab. So conspiracy theorists, I think, are the obvious ones because you do have psychological studies on conspiracy theorists, but it's difficult for them to trust people. You can also get, so I've looked at various other communities like white nationalists, for example. But what's interesting is, although you have communities that are very hard to study in a lab, they write a lot online. And so, you know, I've worked a lot on the conspiracy forum on Reddit, and you have people who write hundreds of thousands of words, even though they would never talk to a researcher. So the key is to find a way to characterize a lot of this without having to read it all. Now, this is where a lot of kind of modern machine learning techniques come in. I'll talk a bit about the techniques I use as I go along, but please feel free to ask questions, you know, if there's something you want to know more about. Just as a kind of background, so, you know, you think if we're not doing individual interviews, if you're not doing experiments, what do you do? Well, two kinds of theses here. One thesis is that, and this is familiar from a lot of social psychology, is that you can characterize people to some degree by the company they keep. So people tend to hang out with people like them, and they tend to have more interactions with people like them than with people who are different from them. Now, if you get enough people and you start looking at the structure of that network, you can find interesting things about them. Now, I want to mention, I mean, this came up in one of our previous studies. If you start thinking longitudinally about this, it's unclear which direction this causality goes. And I think this is an important thing to mention, because a lot of times there's this sort of picture of people being seduced by things online where they kind of stumble into a conspiracy community and become conspiracy theorists. Whereas, you know, this is a quote from the social psychologist Funder that I really like. He says, well, a certain kind of bar may tend to generate a situation that creates fights around closing time. Only a certain kind of person will choose to go to that kind of bar in the first place. And I think that's right. And I think it's interesting to think about some of these things when we're talking about communities. In many cases, these are people who've self-selected online to be part of a community. So most people don't stumble across, say, Stormfront. Stormfront is the white nationalist bulletin board that I've done a bit of work on, and think, oh, this white supremacy sounds intriguing. Typically, they seek it out already, looking for like-minded people. But nevertheless, you can kind of characterize people by the people they're around, and also you can characterize people by the things they say. Now, in some sense, this sounds very abstract and very obvious, but part of the idea is, if you've got somebody who's just writing things on a conspiracy forum and they write enough, you can get a sense of what they're interested in and what's motivating them, even if they never quite say it explicitly. So this is a way to, if you're doing both of these at once, you can I think of it as trying to connect social psychology and individual psychology using what used to be called in the old days something like indirect measures. So you're not asking people, it's observational, but nevertheless, with a lot of information, you can start to extract out patterns. So that's what we did. Erin mentioned two of the papers we did on the Reddit conspiracy subreddit. The first one was mostly looking at content. The second one was looking at both content and kind of how people, where people posted on Reddit before they actually ended up in the conspiracy forum. So you kind of see their pathway through into becoming conspiracy theorists. So that's by way of background. The current work and the stuff I want to talk to you about today is we have a long-running project going, and this is several of the collaborators, Mark Alfano at Macquarie, Ignacio Hea Quintana, who's here, Mark Chiang at Uni Melbourne, and Ritzart Ryman, who did not respond to my request for a better headshot. So there's him at a festival at roughly age 15. Sorry, Ritz. So we have a long-running Twitter scrape. This was Mark's idea way back when he was at Delft. That's just collecting, using the developer API, things on a bunch of different topics. So looking for hashtags, looking for keywords. We had one on vaccination. That's a paper we have out under review now. There was another collection on Black Lives Matters. And one of the things that happened during this collection process is, of course, the murder of George Floyd. So we got interested and we said, well, look, there are different groups. There are obviously different groups interacting. They're interacting on Twitter around Black Lives Matter. And then you have this really, salient, vivid event that kicked off a lot of discussion around Black Lives Matter, which is the murder of George Floyd. So the primary thing we're interested in, and I'll talk about two different analyses that we did today, is characterizing kind of how this interaction evolved, how different subgroups, some of which are nominally aligned and some of which are nominally opposed, well, not just nominally, some of which are quite opposed, interact. And part of this question is, and I think what we're interested in, so I had the word trust in the title, and the overall discovery project that this is part of is about online trust. But a lot of what we've got interested in is what I call more like agenda setting. So you've got Black Lives Matters, it's controversial, how to think about it, how to frame it, is actually a really interesting question. And in some sense, how you talk about it is itself kind of a politicized thing. So trying to figure out something about how that dynamic evolves online, we thought would be a really interesting way to look at how people trust each other and how that kind of trust plays out. I just mentioned one thing. So, one thing we found in this, for example, even whether you call it Black Lives Matter or BLM, so just to go ahead, if you're the kind of US right-winger, so kind of big Trump fan, relatively rarely uses the phrase Black Lives Matters and almost always use BLM. It's actually such a strong correlation that you can use it pretty well as a classifier. So just like the kinds of hashtags you use, for example, can say something about your political leanings. So if you're interested in the data, we collected tweets and retweets on a list of specific keywords and hashtags. The time I'm talking about is from 13 January to 23 July 2020. The murder of George Floyd was, I should know this off the top of my head, it's programmed in May 23rd. We have about 4.6 million base tweets and then 94 million retweets during that time. If people aren't familiar with Twitter, what happens is people can write a tweet, which has a little bit of has context. You can also directly retweet something, which is just signal boosting it. So you're just saying, look, so-and-so said blah. You can also, for people who are really into this, there are quote tweets. There's a complex story about how we deal with quote tweets. But in general, there's we're going to take an assumption here that tweets are you saying something that you think. Retweets are you endorsing something that someone else says. So you retweet something because in some sense you're sympathetic. Now, to do the network analysis, what we do is we constructed what's called a retweet network. So this is a directed graph, and the nodes are going to be authors, and then A is connected to B just in case B retweets something by A. And then the weight of each edge is the number of retweets between the two. Now, it's a function of this definition, although it's not obvious, that people only end up in this network, so only end up as nodes, if they're also tweeting things. So if you're just retweeting and not authoring tweets yourself, you don't end up in the graph. That's because we want to be able to characterize people who are also saying things. Also, that cuts out the cruder of the bots. So there are, lots and lots of bots on Twitter that just sort of retweet things endlessly. Now, we only have tweets about Black Lives Matter here, so we're not looking at everything everyone said. Yes, and of course, and one caveat on this is the developer API, or at least the free version that we used, and this was before the academic API came out, does not guarantee that you get every tweet on a topic. So we're getting some, sample of this. We have no reason to think that it's a biased sample, but we aren't getting every single thing going along. So even though we've got 94 million retweets, that's only a fraction of what's going on. So the first thing we did, and this is the kind of base of then the two different analyses that I'll talk about, is we did what's called a Leiden clustering. So clustering algorithms on networks try to find groups of people who are more connected to each other than they are to everyone else on average. There are several different ways to do this. The Leiden one is the kind of current fancy one. So we tried to find communities that were sort of tightly connected in the sense that they were more connected to each other than to everyone else. There were 4 communities that were large enough to care about. We actually looked at some sub-communities, which only I'll say a little bit about, but actually there's only one place where it's relevant. But the 4 big communities, and then we graphed it. So this is a forest atlas layout. And what you find is a structure sort of like this. So you find this big chunk with a kind of fuzzy border between it, the little purple cluster hanging off, and then a big red cluster over on the other side. Now already, if anyone's used to looking at kind of online network graphs, right, this is a very common structure that you find online. It suggests a certain amount of polarization. And you won't be surprised, so these are the names we've come up with, the 4 clusters, that on one side you've got Republicans, and on the other side you've got Democrats and Black Lives Matter activists. Now, we determined this, and we determined what they were doing, what these people were thinking by a couple of different ways. A lot of manual inspection of the top posters, a lot of, you'll see some of this come out pretty clearly in the content analyses later. Republicans tend to be very easy to pick out on Twitter. They tend to have names like MAGA Mom 1967, and their profile talks about loving Jesus and Trump and sometimes some QAnon things. Democrats, when I say Democrats, these are kind of standard center-left Democrats. AOC is in there, Bernie Sanders is in there, Joe Biden is in there somewhere. So these are what you might think of more as establishment Democrats, and then lots of people who tend to cluster around them. Activists often tend to be people who self-identify as activists and self-identify as Black Lives Matter activists. But there's a wide range of people within that, so you definitely get a distinction between those people who are Black Lives Matters and then a kind of queer and trans community within there, for example. And there's another interesting group. So I should say the activists, they're like maybe 40%, 42% of the whole thing. Democrats and Republicans are each about 25%, 25-30%. And there's this small cluster, which I've called boosters in here. They're about 4%. And these are really interesting people. So I should say, initially, I was very skeptical of them because it looked like they were mostly people who were retweeting Black Lives Matter stuff in order to direct people to their Instagram page or their, wellness center or whatever. There's a large cluster in there. In fact, the majority of them are actually fans of the Korean boy band BTS. They call themselves the BTS Army. So the BTS donated $1 million to Black Lives Matter at some point, and their fans got very excited about this. So they're an interesting group. What I'll say later, I think, actually characterizes them in a bit more sympathetic terms. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that although these are quite opposed people, and you'll see they have very different interests, it's still connected. So you still have Republicans retweeting Democrats and Democrats and activists retweeting Republicans. It's interesting to look at the context in which that happens, but it's not like you've got two completely separated or four completely separate communities. There's still interaction between them, although obviously much tighter in-group interaction than out-group interaction. All right, so we did 2 studies that have fallen off of this now. So the first one is we got really interested in looking through a lot of the data in emoji and hashtags. So one of the features you find, there's quite a lot of emoji and hashtags are a feature of Twitter, but there's also quite a lot of emoji. It was originally a problem because it was kind of annoying to try to clean them out of the data to feed them into other things. And we realized that there's quite a lot of information there. So you find this, and one of the interesting interactions between online and offline presence is you find signs at protests that will include things like hashtags. They will also include pictures of emoji. So the raised fist in the lower right is quite common. And Black Lives Matter hashtag and police brutality. The one at the bottom, although it's less obvious, all of those are actually hashtags that you find, particularly trans Black Lives Matter. Is also ACAB at the bottom for all cops are bastards. It's discrete in there, but that's a very common hashtag as well. So we find all of these and we think, well, what can you do with them? So one thing we found later on is you can actually categorize or cluster people pretty well. Sorry, not cluster. You can figure out which group someone belongs to with a reasonably high accuracy, much higher than chance, just by looking at the emoji they use. So for example, if you use a lot of American flags, you're almost certainly a Republican. If you use a lot of black raised fists, you're almost certainly an activist. But there are interesting and more subtle ones in there. I'll show you one of the pictures soon. So one of the framework we've been using, this is Kukla and Lance, a really interesting book called Yo and Lo, thinking about pragmatics of language and the sort of different pragmatic functions. So in particular, yo and lo. Yo is supposed to be bits of language that call someone's attention to you, and lo is emphasizing something that someone else is saying. It's a very prescient book. I think it's 2009, but actually has kind of a emoji on the front cover. So for people who are not familiar with some of this, just a few words in here. When people think about language, they often divide it into 3 different categories. So there's syntax, which is the rules for assembling utterances. There's semantics, which is how we determine meaning. And then there's pragmatics, which is how we use language to achieve various ends other than communicate directly what's communicated by the semantics. So I know some people are interested in Grice, and the whole study, Gricean implicature is the classic example of pragmatics. So you can utter things that don't seem to have a particularly deep meaning on their own, but can communicate, for example, to people around you that you belong to a certain group, that you believe a certain thing, and so on. So one question you might ask when you think about emoji and hashtags is they don't have much syntax at all, right? They're just kind of units. And although kids these days seem to have some kind of rules for, what a heart in front of a taco means and vice versa, in general, we think of emoji and hashtag as having no particular syntax. So I think a lot of work on it, insofar as anyone thinks about them in terms of semantics. So kind of what's the meaning of the raised black fist? But there's also, you might think, well, one of the interesting things that emoji do is a certain pragmatic function as well. So a lot of the interest in the study is thinking about, well, when people use emoji, are they using them more for their kind of semantic function or more for their pragmatic function? So we went through, and this is, I should say, I'm going to go through one of the groups on this because I want to get to some other stuff. I have more of these graphs if you're interested. This is what, this is primarily the study that I'm not the lead on, so I don't want to say too much about it. But the idea was we looked at emoji, we looked at co-occurrence networks for each of the groups. So you look at emoji and you look at you make another graph that says, look, this emoji and this hashtag tend to occur together. what does that say about the clustering? And you get some really interesting pictures. So the activist one, to start out, this is the kind of general thing you get, right? So you see, and then I should say, insofar as the hashtags are colored, that means they're kind of put together by the clustering algorithm. But in general, you see these interesting patterns. So for example, you get a lot of fists and you get a lot of the skin tone modifiers on the fists. That's a very common thing here, whereas for the Republicans, you tend to get the generic unmodified skin tone fist or the white fist. But here you also find, so in addition to certain things that you might think are just general, like, well, you know, they use a hashtag to express that Black Lives Matter, or to talk about particular people like George Floyd, you're also getting a couple really interesting things. So one is, if you look in this upper left-hand quadrant, there's a lot of the downward pointing finger. So what's interesting about downward pointing finger, and then we've got this, is it's someone retweeting someone who has said, look at this thing below. So someone who has retweeted something but emphasized it. And again, often with, you know, in the activists, you often see this with the black or dark brown skin tone modifiers, to try to call attention. So this is a signal boosting maneuver to say, look, this is the low sorts of thing. You also have calls to action, say her name, and the cluster around Breonna Taylor, as well as things like fire that are trying to, you know, call for a sense of urgency, and the exclamation point. So it seems like one of the things a lot of the emoji and hashtags do is not just convey a certain kind of meaning, but also act as a call to action, or more importantly, a call to attention to other messages. One thing I also wanted to mention, so there's the brown ones, this is the sort of upper right bit. So these are relatively rare in the activist categories, the All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, and White Lives Matter. Texting White Lives Matter in particular a lot is a pretty good sign that you're a white supremacist. We were actually interested in All Lives Matter and whether it's done, whether it's a kind of well-meaning but misguided sort of hashtag, or whether it's mostly malicious. It seems to be mostly malicious, but one thing you find on this agenda setting theme that's really interesting is you do find these, for example, in the activist category, and what it seems to be doing is trying to jam up the algorithms. So when people text All Lives Matter, and if you go to Twitter and search for that, you find people who are like you. But of course, activist groups can, for example, start adding that hashtag as well, so that if you search for it, you'll be redirected to the activist. So you get, in addition to this kind of direct agenda setting, you also get attempts to try to undermine the agenda of other groups. So the conclusion that we've got out of this, and there's of course plenty more to say about how we get to this, is that emoji and hashtags seem to play a range of pragmatic functions. And in some cases, they might be more important than their semantic content. And they're distinctive enough of different groups and subgroups that this seems to be not just a matter of chance, but actually distinctive about the way these different subgroups approach interaction on Twitter. So the second study, and this is one that I've been doing more work on because it goes back to kind of my old stomping grounds with topic modeling. So, you know, the first one could be thought of, we're thinking about pragmatics, the first study, pragmatics and the network structure. This is the network structure and content. And in particular, I'm going to be interested in content over time. So how what people talk about evolves over time, particularly after the murder of George Floyd. So if people aren't familiar with it, topic modeling is a kind of widely used method for dealing with text online. And what it does, it takes a representation of a corpus. A corpus is a collection of documents. And then it decomposes them into what we call a topic word mapping. So it'll give you a bunch of topics. I'll give you an example of this in a second. And a document topic mapping. So it tells you which documents map to which topics and what the topics mean. We actually used, we call aggregated author tweets as our documents. So rather than using individual tweets, which are often quite short and low context, if you take an author and you take everything that they say on Twitter, even if each individual one tends to be kind of short, the collection of all of their tweets tends to be a pretty good representation of what they think, at least on the topic of Black Lives Matter. So in terms of the representation, I sometimes find this easier to handle visually. So essentially what topic modeling does, suppose I cared about the collected corpus of AC/DC songs. What I would do is I would put them in this algorithm and it would give me two matrices. One is what we call the topic word mapping, which gives different themes, and it would look exactly like this. So it would say, look, there's one topic that seems to be about rock and rocking and talking about rock and roll, one that talks, about hell, one that talks about love. And then for each song, you'll get a mapping. So songs can be about more than one topic. So you'll get a mapping of the intensity of the mapping between a particular song and each of the topics. Some topics won't be relevant, other topics will be very important, and others will be minor. So we did this for people who care about the minutia. The way we chose it is we made a bunch of topic models. You always have to pick the number of topics you care about. We use to pick it, we use those as the basis. This is a graph of the discriminability of different clusters given the number of topics. So in other words, how well could you tell what group someone belonged to just from their loadings on these topics? You might think in some ways it's a very large dimensionality reduction algorithm. So it's taking you something like, if you're more familiar with principal components analysis. So you're taking word space, which is several thousand words, down to, a 6 or 10 or 14 dimensional space. And what we found is you can actually distinguish people very well. So the base rate would be either 25% or 40%, depending on how you count. Whereas with this, even though we're in some sense throwing out a lot of information, we can do better than 75, 76%, identifying which group you belong to just given the topics that you load on. So the topic model itself, I'll show some more interesting plots in a second, but this is the kind of output you get. So this is the 14 topic model, which is the one I'll talk about. And so you note that there are several different topics here. There's a kind of main one about, talking about Black Lives Matter. There's one that's more of the kind of hashtag version. There are also ones in here, which will come back around. So for example, topic 11, that gets you so one reason why you might think all lives matter is not in general a kind of sincere but misguided attempt to generalize, is that when it occurs, it tends to occur with Blue Lives Matter, which is the pro-police slogan, but also with Make America Great Again, Where We Go One, We Go All, which was a QAnon a QAnon topic, Keep America Great Again, White Lives Matter, which I don't think anyone texts out of a sincere desire for racial justice. So in some sense, you find, even though some of these, it may be difficult to tell what people are talking about from a single hashtag or a single word. Again, just as we think that people kind of get characterized by the company they keep, words get characterized by the company they keep as well. So to go back to remember we had this structure, so we've got these groups. Now, I want to give you not all of these, but just the kind of power of this at looking longitudinally at the different groups. So for example, with the activists, you find two topics. They're going to be the green in these. This is a kind of smooth loading over time with the dotted gray line so this is by day, and the dotted gray line is going to be George Floyd. So you get interesting structure in the activists. You get the first topic, which is primarily discussing Black lives and how they matter. You also get, this is where you get things, for example, about trans lives. So some of the LGBTQ movement is in there. There's also what we call the angry topic, topic 5, that's seems to be mostly about expressing strong emotion and strong kind of personal emotion about the topic of Black Lives Matters. So what you find is that although everyone peak kind of changes after George Floyd, what you find is that talking about Black lives in particular and talking about them with a kind of particularly emotionally charged valence tends to be distinctive of the activists. Whereas the Democrats tend to focus much more on what we might call the kind of hashtag version, and this really peaks after Floyd. There's also more discussion about protests and political movements, and discussion of one, I think this is one that's not on there, but about racial justice more in the abstract. So one of the things that distinguishes Democrats and activists, even though they're nominally on the same, or they are on the same side in many ways, is a kind of more personal versus a more impersonal way of discussing the issues. Now, one of the things we found that's I think is quite interesting in terms of agenda setting is what happens with the Republicans. So you have one topic that's primarily devoted, we might call it the pro-police topic. Basically, no one else says much at all about this. What you find is a steady decline and then a really strong dip after Floyd in talking about, back the blue, law and order, these kinds of things. So there's a narrative that's quite common among the Republicans before Floyd talking about, essentially kind of in-group loyalty, I think of it. So, we're part of the police protect us, this sort of thing. And my read on this is that, the events were so shocking that it temporarily and then long-term, so there are actually like tests and all of that. I'm sparing you tables of significance tests, but longer term, it also declines quite a bit. Unfortunately, what you find is that instead, there's a real spike in characterizing Democrats and Antifa as Marxist terrorists, talking about how they're against America, they're communists, they're violent. So there's a real shift from this kind of in-group loyalty to an out-group vilification. You also get, what's interesting is the lower topic 11, a lot of these, there's a lot of QAnon and a lot of more conspiracy theory oriented stuff that's actually there even relatively early on. It's not super popular, but then spikes again after Floyd. So what you find, what you're seeing in this is a real shift from, again, thinking of, the primary question is, do you back the police or not? To, well, these BLM folks, they're all, communist Antifa terrorists. I should note, for some of these people, like, you go and look at their profile now, and they're still primarily concerned with Antifa and how it's destroying America and so on. So it's become a very kind of consistent, popular way to respond within at least within the US right-wing context. Finally, the boosters do interesting things, but the primary thing they do is, alongside with and often in step with the activists, they do a lot of, this is why I call them boosters, signal boosting. So they're talking about signing petitions, going to protests, donating, and I think most of the donations are to bail funds. There's a strong correlation between this and actual protests. So it seems like they're there, and, they perform this important signal boosting role as well. Otherwise, what they talk about seems to be largely whatever is topical. Now, one thing you might wonder, and I sort of want to leave some time for questions, so I'll end with this. One thing you might wonder is whether this is all just politics. So there's one topic that's clearly about the US election. The people who talk about it, the activists don't seem to care about this very much. So it's really Republicans and Democrats fighting it out. And you might think some of this, obviously, both the sort of Republican and Democrat framing is trying to put this as an election issue, either, a pro-Democrat or pro sort of law and order Republican issue. What's interesting, though, is you might see, like, after Floyd, this actually dips quite a bit on both sides. And one thing you can calculate for all of these, which we did, is how well this correlates with the number of Black Lives Matter protests per day. And what you find is that there's a significant anti-correlation between talking about politics and talking about politics and the number of protests that are going on. So it's almost like, this is politicized, but insofar as it's politicized, it's sort of, the talking politics is what you do when there's not street protests. When there are street protests, you go to talking about the protests instead. So I think, and I'm interested in this, that there's some kind of delicate balance here between things which are obviously politically relevant and trying to, for lack of a better word, politicize those and how you think your audience is going to respond. So just to conclude on that, topic modeling gives us some sense of how different groups interact in order to set agendas and frame the terms of the debate. Now, what next? I think I just put what next on all the slides. That's a really interesting question. A lot of what we're doing now is we've got a lot of the results, we're writing them up, and we're thinking about framing. So any obvious problems would be great to know now, but also anything, that this sparks from your own research or ideas that you've been working with would be very helpful for us, because, there's a lot of different lenses on this same set of data that we'd like to put, and, learning new things would be really helpful. So just a quick thanks to the Australian Research Council for paying the bills, and also again to my collaborators. So that's that.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. Thanks for taking us through, innovative ways to use online communication to understand some of these dynamics. So we might open up to questions and discussion. For me, what I think is very powerful about this form of analysis is that it's kind of tracking real world events and showing how people are responding to that online in a way that you could never really capture at other points in history, right? So because everyone is online, it is really, as you mentioned before, a tool to understand some of these dynamics and how people are making sense of what's going on, how they're doing that collectively, how they're communicating sort of in our terms, their identities, how they're trying to mobilize people to their cause, processes of influence and mobilization. I'm aware of other work in sort of political psychology and social psychology, which I've sort of got some questions about and how it fits with your data.
Yeah.
But I guess what is your view, given that you're sort of at the front end of this, of the opportunities of this as a research tool?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously I'm pro it as a research tool. I think one of the things that, comes in, I mentioned only briefly in the topic modeling, but I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is trying to figure out, we were talking about this beforehand, but this is not just like kicking you a softball. I am really interested in this, is about the link between online and offline behavior. Because, I mean, I think Black Lives Matter is a really interesting one because there's quite a lot of this is going on Twitter, but obviously this is still only a fraction of the people who are actually involved in protests and of course who are actually affected by the movement. So some of this, I think there's an interesting question about so one is how representative these people are, and two, whether this represents more like the vanguard of thought or whether it's kind of tracking, what's going on, for example, like Fox News proposes a way of framing and then people on Twitter pick it up, or whether it goes vice versa. You can see some of this, I think this has fallen off the study at some point, but there are, you can see attempts to frame things that come up and fall away. So there's, in addition to defund the police, which shows up, and actually I think for a while might get more popular among the Republicans, but you also see like reform the police come in, and you see a couple attempts of people trying to make that happen and it failing. So you can see things like, it's almost like a laboratory for different ways to frame this, some of which catch on and some of which don't. And you actually see, and there are a couple of them, I can't remember now, but there are definitely ones where like people are trying to, hijack sounds too strong, but you definitely get people who are trying to take this and link it to, so one, Me Too ends up in there fairly consistently, I think in the Democrats. What's interesting is that tends not to work. I mean, so you see people like try to link it to another issue, it floats around for a little bit and dies. So I think that kind of dynamic and trying to find ways to map up what's going on online with what's going on offline, and particularly if you've got sort of time series data, that's what I'm really excited about for this. So I'm doing some of this with the protests, obviously, but if, once you've got this kind of representation, you can look at all sorts of things with, correlations. I've got some auto-regression models that I didn't show, but thinking about, how one topic affects another topic over time and whether one's leading or one's lagging, that sort of thing. So I think finding ways to link those two up would be really interesting.
I've got a few more questions, but let's hand over. I can't see the participant list, but you can, Erin, so maybe you're best sort of managing some of this.
Okay, so we have Nima next, and Nima, I believe you're unmuted, so we should be able to speak.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Colin, for the presentation. That was very interesting. I have a couple of questions. Feel free to answer one of them because I know other people have questions as well. So first, I was wondering if you have any theory before you analyze the data. That's one thing, because sometimes I see this, which is interesting to me, this method that people get the data without any theory, and then they see what kind of stories that consistently come up from the data. I was wondering which of these two you use. And the other question is that, have you thought about any discourse analysis? Because obviously when you talk about the language, one of the potential analyses can be a discourse analysis. And my last question is that, to what extent do you think what we see online is it just a representation what is going on out there, or it's something more than that? Thank you very much.
Good. Well, so I'll do those kind of in reverse order. I mean, I think the question of whether it's a representation or not, just to go back to Kate's question, is a really interesting one. And I think that's, I think in some sense it's both, right? So you're getting some sense, sometimes it's merely reflecting, sometimes it's driving. Trying to disentangle those two is really interesting. The discourse analysis people have brought up before, if I can find someone who knows how to do it, we'll throw that at it too. If you've got experience in it, let's chat offline. As far as so the first question I want to mention, because this lets me put my philosopher of science hat back on, because I think this is actually a really good one. And sometimes with my philosopher of science hat on, I'm kind of slightly disturbed at what my social online media hat wearing fellow does. So it's interesting because it is very easy. And one of the problems with this, so compared to traditional psychological research, is you've got so much stuff that you can tell stories very easily. Now, here's the way I've come to think about it. And I actually think this is a completely separate paper that I'm forever trying to finish about how to think about, so we often make a distinction between exploratory and confirmatory analyses. And typically when people make this, exploratory analysis is just shorthand for kind of crappy, or like with fewer restrictions and that sort of thing. I've come to think of a lot of what we do and a lot of the phases that this kind of goes through is there's an exploratory section where what you want is what an exploratory analysis tells you is things that would be interesting to do a more focused investigation on, because you would be more likely to get an answer if you looked there. So the answer might be pro or con, but when you have so much data and so many different questions you can ask, one of the purposes of an exploratory analysis is to drill down on the ones that might actually be fruitful. So in general, what we do is there's a very long time of poking things and graphing things, and then we say, look, I think that there's a hypothesis, for example, that we make a topic model, if we make a proper topic model and we look at what happens to the activists after this point, then we'll find that it increases, or that we'll find that it correlates with protests. And then, so we collect up a lot of those, and then we go and then we look and we do the, kind of proper significance testing, and we kind of try to set those hypotheses out. Now, I think there's a kind of interesting sociological question that happens with a lot of this stuff about the order in which those go and whether one needs to kind of rigorously firewall between the exploratory and confirmatory phase. But in general, what I've been, a lot of how I've tried to approach this is first kind of find some things that look like they might be hypotheses by looking at the data, and then try to think of rigorous ways to test them that don't just involve doing what I just did, but pretending like I'm doing something else. So that's the big picture. I think that's actually, it's a really fascinating question about how methodologically to approach some of this stuff. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nima. So Mike, I can see you're unmuted, ready to go.
Okay, Colin, really interesting presentation, but I kept waiting for some kind of indication that you looked into the actual dynamics of these things. I mean, you've got a lot of time series data there. What the hell is the autocorrelation structure doing? Is it does it look like it's a homeostatic kind of thing, or does it do cascade things the way that happen with fads and fashions? Do the dynamics look the same? Does the autocorrelation structure look the same across different topics? Did it change dramatically after George Floyd, for instance, and so on?
Good question. So here's a VAR model on the topics. They're surprising that the topic loadings themselves are stationary via AD Fuller across the whole time series. I haven't actually rerun this with the pre-post, although I mean to. And you do find really interesting, so these are just the significant interactions. If you've got experience, by the way, with this, it would be really nice to talk to you more, or someone in your lab more, because we've kind of done some basic stuff on this, but we're not entirely comfortable with pushing it further, that we're doing it right. But this one I'm reasonably confident in, and you do find really interesting interactions between the topics. So just to mention, point out some of them, like topic 6, which is the petition and tweeting one, seems to be really driving the Black topic one, the Black Lives Matter is one. You've got things in most cases, and one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I'm trying to extract out of this to give you some like capsule summaries, it seems like most of the topics that the Republicans load on heavily seem to be largely reactive. So it seems to be that, you know, other topics, including topics outside of the Republican sphere, push those, but not vice versa. Whereas the activist topics, well, the activists seem to be primarily, like, the driver of that seems to be the angry topic, and the Democrat one seems to be more complicated. So this is something I'd really like to do more with, because I think it shows that, at least in this case, my suspicion is, from having run a few different versions of this, that you're going to find that the and you know, you can, if you look at the impulse plots, it's pretty clear as well. You find that the Republicans are kind of driven, are much more reactive, and are also reactive to protests, whereas it really is the activists primarily who are driving protests, and the Democrats are somewhere in between and pick up after Floyd. So they tend to be more reactive before Floyd and pick up after. But I'd love to talk to you more about how to, like, really nail this down at some point.
Yeah, glad to do it. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Joanne, I can see you're unmuted. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. I have a quick question because I'm sorry, I had another meeting, so I missed the beginning part. I wonder what Colin's thoughts are on the disambiguation function of these emojis, since written sentences are quite impoverished, and the emojis plays a pretty much important role in indicating what kind of intended emotion that was being expressed there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I haven't thought about that much, although I'll have to ask Mark whether he's done more on this, because some of it, you know, so for example, one of the ones I didn't show, let me show you the Republicans on the emoji map. I think you do find a use of emojis, as you do in, you know, everyday life, of precisely that kind of disambiguation function. So you're retweeting, but so for example, here, I can just move this around for a bit. So this is the kind of emoji co-occurrence network for the Republicans. And you actually find a lot of these where they're, you know, retweeting people who are laughing about something, or they're angry about something. You get signal boosting, but again, you note that compared to the activists, basically all of these are either default skin tone or white skin tone. So I think some of these are, it's interesting, right? Because if you're retweeting something about Black Lives Matters, but you're within the, you know, Trump community, it may be quite important for you to, you know, point out that you're doing it, you know, to laugh at people because you're angry at it, because you think it's like surprising and shocking and so on. So that's interesting. I mean, I think that's probably right, that this is one of the, you know, one of the things it's doing is just signaling this kind of emotional valence that's very hard to do in something as short as a tweet. Another thing it's doing, so many of these are clearly affiliative. You get the US flag, you get the US minor outlying islands flag, which turns out to look like the US flag on some versions of Android. But also, you know, randomly Christian symbols, and this seems to be mostly a prayer symbol within this community. So you're getting a lot of affiliative information and also emotional information. Now, I think it's an interesting question whether you want to put that more in the pragmatics or more in the semantics. Whereas some of the things like, you know, more alarm signals, again, attention drawing symbols, approval symbols, this sort of thing, have a more clearly pragmatic function.
Thank you.
I can't see a hand up, so I'm going to steal a question while I can. Extending on this discussion about the emojis, it's sort of curious, right? Because if people are using them to communicate their feelings towards it, or for even for pragmatic reasons, it reminds me of the research on the extent to which people actually remember or use those kinds of tags in their decision making later on.
Oh,
Right. So if
interesting.
I share something and I do some sort of disapproval sign using an emoji, there may be a sort of backfire in that I'm sharing a message that I disapprove of more, which is going to lead to it being sort of received and agreed upon from more audiences. So I think there's a curious, so clearly people are using it for these different reasons, and you can see that in your data. But I wonder about what the sort of information processing perspective might tell you about what is the end point here. Like, you're doing it for this reason, but the end result is actually that you're increasing the familiarity of that message.
Yeah, that is really interesting, actually. I hadn't thought about it that way, but of course, yeah, you're right. So suppose you know, I retweet something about Black Lives Matters with my like angry emoji to my Trump friends, but in some sense, I'm also still signal boosting whatever the Black Lives Matters thing is, and it may be that tag fades away while the message sticks around a little bit, which would be really interesting. Yeah, no, that's good. I should talk to you more about I hadn't thought about the information processing perspective on that, but that seems like it would be a really interesting place to look.
Yeah, it's curious. I think your data, also data that we haven't seen from the cognitive psych perspective.
Yeah.
So it's really, really curious. I can see another question from Kirsty. Kirsty, would you like to talk so you get the chance to explain? I'm going to allow you to talk. So you can just unmute, Kirsty, and then you can tell us a little bit about your question.
I just think that the rise in incels is a really disturbing trend, and it seems to me that should be more research. So I'm hoping you'll get there at some point too.
Yeah, so I know there are definitely people working on it. So Simon Copland, who's a PhD student in sociology now, it might be finishing up, has done a lot of work on toxic masculinity online with similar, so he's a student of Robert Ackland's downstairs, and his stuff is really cool. It's similar kinds of things. So what you find, there are dedicated incel communities, for example, but you can also find differences. So you know, between, or I remember he gave a nice presentation of differences between, you know, several different kinds of online toxic masculinity. So for example, incels versus pickup artists versus red pill versus men going their own way, which, you know, are all kind of different ways, and I think arguably different life stages with different groups of people. So from the outside, if you don't care about them that much, they all just kind of seem like misogynists, but you look through and you can actually find really interesting differences in their interaction structure, really interesting differences in the kinds of language they use. Some of that language is actually, you get this online affiliative thing. So there's like particular vocabulary. This is not just, you know, these groups, but really any online group will come to have particular vocabulary that marks you out, not just as a general, you know, as a kind of proud misogynist, but as a particular strand of misogynist and so on. So there's interesting stuff about that. There's interesting stuff about radicalization online that one of my co-authors, Mark Alfano, has done some work on, looking at processes of radicalization, both sort of in the obvious political sense, but also something like incels. So I think there is work being done on that, not by me, but I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. And again, this is one of these cases where being able to do stuff online gives you really like this fantastic resource of people who are otherwise you would not get much insight into how they feel and what they're talking about.
Thanks, Colin. And thanks, Kirsty, for the question. It sounds like there'll be several follow-up conversations here. It sounds like.
Yes, please. I hope so. This is exactly like, it's so good to talk to psychologists. Get studies, get ideas.
Well, it's been very insightful, and we all have to disappear off to a staff meeting soon. I'll let Kate, do you want to wrap things up?
No, I really just wanted to thank you for the presentation today. I think there's lots of points of connection. I can't really differentiate the kind of work that you're doing from much of the work that we're seeing emerging in psychology, and that, I guess, points to a very fruitful point of contact. For me, you know, one of the interesting questions, you would have seen it through Cambridge Analytica type models, which are precisely about trying to categorize people into groups and then see what impact that has. Is this relationship between online behavior and sort of behavior offline, I guess, and whether we've got any evidence that one is affecting the other. But yeah, lots of questions. So I think, Colin, we're going to have to organise another point of interaction. Obviously, Mike Smithson and others will follow up. But let's make this the beginning of some connections between what you're doing and the work here.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. So,
yeah, so thank you very much, Colin.
Yeah.
You don't want to join us for our staff meeting?
Oh, it's exciting, but I've got something I'm sure equally exciting coming up soon.
Okay.
So.
Okay, thanks, Colin.
All right, thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.